I'm joined by my co-host Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, welcome to the show. This time for real. I don't know if people
Okay.
saw our little gag earlier, but for
Are
real.
we doing it now? This
This
is
is
this
for
is
real.
this is a go. This is a go. Great. Thank you very much, Jose Luis. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, as usual, writing for Jacobin en Estados Unidos, Sentido Común here in Mexico, ready for a special election night edition of Soberanía.
So I think I forgot to even introduce myself there. I was so excited to get going. I'm Jose Luis Granado Ceja, as always, here to serve, Mexican journalist living and working in Mexico City. And so we thought we'd do a special episode here, go live and address the big stories because, we were in our production meeting and we are like, well, there's a lot happening on Tuesday and we usually put the
Yeah.
episode out on Tuesday. So it made sense to do this. I thought we should start. We're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about the monumental decision, historic, even in the terms of the Supreme Court, President Norma Pina vote today, the Mexican Supreme Court, around their efforts to basically revert the already approved constitutional reform, and of course, the U.S. elections. We have to join the crowd here making a special episode tonight to talk about the U.S. election, but obviously, we're going to give you the Mexican angle. We're going to give you the perspective from two journalists here in Mexico, and we're going to have a special guest as well. We have a special guest joining us from Censura, and he's just getting settled in. It's been a very busy day for those of us here in Mexico who've been following this long experience. I hope it's the end of it. We'll fill you in on that. But let's get started on the judicial reform decision that happened at the Supreme Court today. I'm going to wait for people to see if they can join us a little bit. In the meantime, I'm going to share this story here on the screen, which is, of course, Kurt's article around this. I thought it was an excellent resource for us here in terms of the laying out the scenario for us,
Yeah,
kind
we
of
can kind of
putting
walk
it all
through that
together.
as people are joining. Yeah.
Exactly. In the meantime. So, Kurt, like I said, you wrote this excellent piece just published this week in Jacobin magazine, and it gets into everything that kind of led up to this moment. And I'm being intentionally vague for those of you who don't know what the decision was, because we really want to break that down and talk about everything that happened, but we want to do it in a chronological order. So I figure we start here. Kurt, set at the stage for us while I walk us through this article as well.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So thanks very much, Jose Luis. So, just for those of you who've been following the issue on um, our podcast, and we've talked a lot about it because it's been the seminal issue of these last few months. Um, in February, to go back a little bit, we've got some time, right? This is the special show. Um, Lopez Obrador presented a package of 20 constitutional reforms, really laying down the gauntlet, saying, framing the debate for the election, right? The campaign ahead. There's a lot of goodies in there, and we've talked about it on the show, right? Some of them are I mentioned at the beginning of this piece, right? Which includes authorizing the Federal Housing Authority in Infonavit to build social housing, 1 million social units, returning the energy sector to public control, Pemex and the Federal Electricity Commission, restoring the passenger train network. There's a lot in there, and that's going through. That's happening. Those are happening. Unlike the U.S. Democrats, Morena wastes no time in getting its stuff going. So um, the big one in there was the judicial reform. Now, AMLO tried to reform, the energy sector and a lot of other things through, standard laws in his administration, and the Supreme Court was just knocking them back, knocking them back, knocking them back, knocking them back. Added to this, the endemic corruption of the Supreme Court, the nepotism rate of 1 and 2, 50% of federal judiciary workers are there, relatives of the judges. A series of high-profile releasing of people, a lot of times on Saturdays, the sabadazos. We know how corrupt the federal judiciary is in Mexico and state levels, and bribes, and they're the supreme conservative power, as AMLO called it. They're the supreme conservative power, and that's the way they've acted. They haven't acted as anything remotely like an objective judicial body. They've acted as a conservative trench. And it's funny that AMLO early on in his term said, the judicial branch needs some cleaning up. how about you present a proposal to reform, right? And they're like, no, we're fine. Thanks. We're good. And that's the way it rolled, right? They thought that they were, you know, above everything because they have been traditionally. The way it was set up is that judges would basically police themselves through the Consejo de Judicatura, controlled by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And despite rampant cases of corruption throughout the years in the Supreme Court, almost nobody has ever been punished for anything. And if they were, it was just very silly little slaps on the wrist. So they thought that was the way it was going to continue because they did not think that Morena was going to get the qualified majority at this election. They didn't. They bet against it. They bet against it, right? A lot of people didn't think they were going to get there. So once Morena did get its qualified majority, they're like, "Oh f, this thing is happening. This thing is for real." You know, this isn't just a campaign thing. This isn't just AMLO fustigating against judges. This is happening. And actually, it was one of the first ones that AMLO pulled out of the 20. He said, this one's going now, and I'm going to use my political capital to pass it now in my last month in office with the new Congress sworn in. And that's what happened, right? Morena used its qualified majority, passed the judicial reform. The judicial reform calls for direct elections of federal judges and the entire Supreme Court. Half of them will be up in 2025, the other half in 2027, right? And it also sets up a disciplinary body with more teeth, right? Now, current justices can participate if they want, right? They can participate. Actually, they have what's called the pase directo, right? They can go directly if they choose to participate. A lot of them have decided not to, out of pique or whatever else, they're deciding not to. As a matter of fact, 8 of the 11 justices of the Supreme Court, the conservative 8, handed in their resignations at the end of October to benefit from the very generous golden handshake provided by the reform to smooth their way out. But that hasn't stopped them, their golden handshake, from trying to torpedo this reform. And we've talked about it on the show, right? How have they done that? First of all, they tried to stop the debate from happening. They tried to freeze the debate from happening in Congress. They tried to freeze the debate from happening in the committee stage. They tried to stop the reform from going from the floor of the Congress to the state legislatures to be ratified. Then that judge from Veracruz, Nancy Juarez, sent in an injunction to try to force the president to erase, get out her eraser and erase the reform from the federal registry, right? The Diario Oficial de la Federación, which is illegal. You can't do that, right? And as President Sheinbaum pointed out very coolly, right, and, as is her style, right, is she asking me to commit a crime? Is that what she's trying to do? Like in the United States, presidents have nothing to do with the constitutional reform. It's the Congress that decides and the state legislatures that decides. The president has no say in this. So even if a reform had gotten to Sheinbaum that she disagreed with, she was still obligated to publish it in the Federal Registry once it had been approved by 2/3 of both houses and 50% plus one of the state houses, as it works in Mexico. The president, so she was asked today, at the by someone from El Financiero on the Mañanera. They're like, are you worried that this is going to scare off investors and blah 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 blah? The standard question. And she's like, ask the Supreme Court. They're doing this. They're doing this. This is them. This is on them. This isn't on me. All I did was receive the reform and publish it in the official registry. And then they told her, some judge, right, with a history of disciplinary problems, who'd never been punished, of course. Actually, she was punished, and then they removed the punishment. Said, you have to erase it. And Sheinbaum said, no, I'm not going to erase it. So they're just pulling things out of their hats in this desperate attempt to try to make the president appear like they're in contempt of court, to try to set up a media scandal, an international media scandal, and then even try to take stronger measures, right? As we have over here on the screen. Then it was the Supreme Court's turn to get in on the act, right? Throughout October, it accepted a series of petitions from opposition legislators and political parties to stop the reform. Now, this is error number one, because political parties do not have what we know in English as standing to contest constitutional reforms. What does standing mean? Standing means that you have to be personally affected by something in order to sue for it. You can't just sue in the abstract. That's what standing means. And it's well established that political parties do not have standing on these matters. As a matter of fact, there's a whole separate court for electoral matters, the Electoral Tribunal, plus the fact that it's a constitutional matter. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Supreme Court's pulling stuff out of their hat. They're making shit up. What do they care? So they accepted the case, which they shouldn't have done in the first place. They accepted the case. They legitimated the standing of political parties. Right? So on October 28, Justice Juan Luis Alcántara Carranca, incidentally, the now infamous dinner between Chief Justice Norma Pina and opposition political leaders, right, from the PRI, Samuel Alito, and they also invited Samuelito. Yeah, Alito, right? Who's the name of the president of the PRI?
Alito Moreno.
I'm thinking of a U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Alito Moreno, right?
You're getting ahead of us, Kurt. We're going to get to the U.S. soon. You're getting too excited here. Starting to confuse you.
They're all corrupt. Alito Moreno. They also invited the president of the PAN, Marco Cortés. Didn't go. So just imagine that. Just to start, right? That the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was having dinner in another Chief Justice's house. He wasn't there, but he lent the house. And then she said that they wasn't there. And then it just came out a few days ago that she'd been lying, and it was indeed there, right? So Antonio's going to be joining us in a moment.
All right, and while you take a minute there to fill in, and Antonio, I shared the link with you as well. Give that a share. I put a link in the chat there for those who are joining us on YouTube here that has Kurt's piece. So if you want to follow along with us, I just wanted to highlight here a comment from somebody who says they just voted. They're saying hello from New York City, and they just voted and wrote in Claudia Sheinbaum on their ballot.
Oh, that's great
for president.
That's great. You love to hear that, right?
Exactly. I mean, there's lots of people putting in a lot of interesting write-ins there during this election. I've been seeing on social media. That's the first one with the Mexican connection that I've seen, so that's always fun. I also got a hello from the Bay Area. Love the videos. Thanks so much. Anyway, while we get back to the story here, so Kurt's been catching us up. Everything that's led to this moment today, finally, the Supreme Court, like as you said here, getting in on the act, decided to accept all of these positions. And then actually, what is this? What do we make of it? Is this a coup attempt?
I'm back here. I'm back. I just shared the link on Twitter for the people who aren't in yet. So Alcántara Carranca comes out with this draft ruling. And as I put in the article, to give it a U.S. connection, it was eerily similar to the Bush v. Gore decision of 2000. Those of us who are old enough to remember, the Supreme Court of the United States in 2000 stepped in to stop the Florida recount, which would, by any objective measure, have given Al Gore the victory in Florida and the presidency. So it was Bush, Poppy's buddies on the Supreme Court who gave the election to his son. That was a technical coup d'etat in the United States. Think the United States is above coup d'etats? Obviously not. The Supreme Court in the United States, again, made up something because the Constitution in the U.S. gives the states control of their own elections, quite clearly. So the Bush v. Gore decision infamously limited itself to the present circumstances, saying we know there's no precedent for this and we don't want this to establish a precedent. It's just for now. This is exactly what Alcántara Carranca drafts tried to say. The text took great pains to present itself as exceptional. 9 times it used the word exceptional, and an exceptionality 5 times. So he couldn't avoid the fact that it's settled precedent here that, and it's really obvious, that a constitutional amendment can't be unconstitutional. This should be by definition obvious, right? Just by definition. So he had to accept that. So he tries to contort the argument to contend that the offending parts of the Constitution that provides for judicial elections are not constitutional level text at all, but downgradable to simple federal electoral law and thus susceptible to being overturned. In other words, the parts I like are Constitution. The parts I don't like, they're not really Constitution. They're just electoral law, and so we can overturn them. So sophistry run amok. And that was his, that was the case that he made. So then, in an interview on Radio Formula, a conservative former Supreme Court Justice Jose Ramon Cosillo from the Fox era, interestingly, one of his NGO, the Instituto para el Fortalecimiento del Estado de Derecho, is funded by USAID, then kind of got all foaming at the mouth, saying that anyone who disobeyed the ruling could be declared in rebellion and thrown out of office and put on trial. Just the most silly stuff. Just the most silly, ridiculous stuff. And you had the radio host, Azucena Oresi, like, oh, really? Oh, well, that's interesting. Oh, well, I didn't know that. And don't they have to be stripped of their immunity first? The desafuero is like, no desafuero. They can, arrest, they can throw them out of office directly and put them on trial. Kind of evoking the worst kind of, guerrilla courts of Latin American, dictatorships and such. That kind of real nasty stuff. Fortunately, in the context of things now, it just sounded ridiculous. But there's a very dark history behind things like that. It just sounded, silly and ridiculous and ludicrous. All the more interesting because Cosillo's NGO is funded by USAID. And of course, this was for international consumption. Interestingly, in the New York Times a few years ago, who did they dedicate a whole half page to in the New York Times of their very expensive real estate in the New York Times? To Alcántara Carranca, saying, oh, well, he's providing an interesting compromise. Right? It's not a compromise. It's not a compromise. It's a coup. It's a coup. They amended the Constitution, and the Supreme Court is trying to say we can overturn constitutional amendments. If they can do that, they can do anything. They can pick apart the Constitution bit by bit. And the New York Times like, oh, well, this is an interesting compromise. And then you had a bunch of buenonditas here in Mexico repeating the New York Times line, repeating basically the U.S. line, word by word. I'm not going to give names, but we all know who I'm talking about. Supremely irresponsible, giving credence to the idea that what Alcántara Carranca was doing was a compromise and a negotiation and a possible way of getting at a settlement instead of vulgar coup-mongering. And there's no negotiating with coup-mongering. You don't give an inch to these people. You don't give a millimeter to these people. Nothing. Nothing. Zero. It's a coup. Fortunately.
Hold on, before you get to it, because I wanted to jump in on that point in particular.
Oh, yeah, please.
Because I find it really quite extraordinary the way what a coup attempt was being sold as. The way that you just described here, oh, it's just a compromise. Some people called it a lifeline or salvavidas in Spanish, right? We're going to rescue the president from her own conundrum. We're going to stop this constitutional crisis from happening. Now, a couple of things. I agree with the president when she's like, I don't even want to call it a crisis because it's not a crisis. If it could be said that there are sides to this, there's one side, Morena, which, as you eloquently laid out here, the history, won an election largely on its commitment to deepen its fourth transformation of Mexico, which includes cleaning house in the judicial branch. We've had a lot of episodes where we've talked about this. Feel free to check out past episodes and learn more about some of the discussions that happened around the time if you're interested in that. But of course, they have a very bad reputation. The Mexican public was very enthused about this proposal and delivered the mandate to do it. Now, Morena receives this mandate and then acts through on it, follows through, passes the reform. And this reform is a democratic transformation to suggest that you should have to go through the elite judicial branch, the highest court of the land, which actually in our Constitution doesn't have the right to do constitutional reviews of constitutional reforms, is to say that there is no peaceful path to transformation.
In the U.S., neither. The Supreme Court can't touch a constitutional amendment. No
Of course
way.
not. Of course not.
No. Otherwise, they could do anything. They almost can do anything now. Imagine that. That would be the last thing they would need.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Who knows what would have happened to the U.S. as what's left of its democracy. But the point being that the implications of this are tremendous. I mean, so let's take the New York Times, which ran this nearly full page with a huge picture of Alcántara Carranca, the Supreme Court justice, arguing for this compromise. Right? The liberal New York Times, right? The pro-democracy New York Times. And I will note as well that Cedillo wrote an opinion piece for the Washington Post. So these papers that bill themselves as defenders of liberal democracy, as champions of U.S. foreign policy throughout the world, which purports to do likewise defend liberal democracy, is basically saying, no, if the results don't appease the people at the top, then we don't actually have to respect the democratic outcome and what that democratic outcome produces. No, some elite group of Supreme Court ministers can shut it down. It basically closes the door to peaceful transformation. Everything that has happened in Mexico has been on that path, to the chagrin of many people who believe in a more radical path. But López Obradorismo, la Cuarta Transformación, whatever you want to call it, Humanismo Mexicano, Mexican humanism, the political project has always been peaceful transformation, to not resort to another violent conflict as in the previous transformations, and the most recent one being the Mexican Revolution, which cost millions of lives. And so to actually suggest that you can't carry out a mandate, an explicit one that was delivered by the voters, is to shut the door. And I think it's absolutely an extraordinary position for these so-called self-described liberals and their newspapers and mouthpieces. It really is an affront to everything that they claim to represent. And I think is quite telling in terms of how actually sincerely they believe this. You know, it actually reminds me of Kissinger's famous quote where he's referring to the Chileans who elected Allende, right? We can't let those sons of bitches elect whoever they want. And that's been the story so far. And so even from that basis, it's quite disappointing to see this position taken by the New York Times, the Washington Post, you know, opinion makers, columnists, right, think tank operators, et cetera, when it comes to judicial reform. All right, I'm going to take a pause there to welcome our guest, Antonio Ruiz from Sin Censura. Antonio, thank you so much for joining us today. You arrived at the perfect time. We're ready to drop the big news that happened today. For those of you who haven't been following, I'm going to say it now, Kurt, pay attention. The coup failed. The coup failed. The Supreme Court did not succeed in its attempt to revert that democratic mandate I was talking about. And I'm very glad to see
Spoiler alert, Jose Luis. Yeah, we were leading up to it. It was getting really dramatic. Welcome, Tonio. Let me...
My pleasure.
For those of you who don't know El Estimado, Antonio Ruiz, just want to introduce him very briefly to the audience. Tonio is a Mexican journalist, studied at the Carlos Septién Garcia School of Journalism, is a graduate of the Technical and Technological University of Mexico's Law School, pursuing his law license at the moment, and is the news director of news over at Sin Censura TV, where we are friends and colleagues. Oops, let me just open this up. Here we are. Before that, he was editor-in-chief of the Azteca America newscasts, where in addition to being in charge of that news outlet, he conducted several campaigns to benefit the Mexican community in the United States, together with journalist Vicente Serrano. He's also worked in his early days as a reporter of the international section of the newspaper La Crónica, and later joined the online version of Univision in Mexico City as a reporter. Has also collaborated with the tech magazine En Tech, and later became editor of Azteca American newscasts. during the celebrations for the bicentennial of independence and the centennial of the Mexican Revolution. He worked as a producer and reporter at the Centro de Producción de Programas Informativos y Especiales, and then returned to TV Azteca as a reporter for the international section, and was finally promoted to editor-in-chief of the Azteca America newscast. So you're looking at someone, ladies and gentlemen, who survived TV Azteca and has lived to tell the tale. Tonio, welcome to Soberanía. Thanks for joining us.
It's such a pleasure. I'm honored to be here in Soberanía, finally to be able to meet with Jose Luis Granados. And obviously, it's such a pleasure to be with you here, dear Kurt Hackbert. And yeah, I did survive TV Azteca. I could say, like Martí, that I know the monster because I have lived in its entrails. So yeah, it's it is a monster, TV Azteca. But yeah, and yeah, the coup failed, and I'm also very happy about what developed. The news that just developed a couple of hours ago. Well, we were also broadcasting about the election here in the United States. I do want to apologize for arriving here so late, but I had to drive from KCK, Kansas City, Kansas, to Kansas City, Missouri, and there was like a little bit of traffic, and I'm really sorry to be this late.
No problem. Actually, we were just catching people up on the background of the judicial reform to set the stage for today's news, which we're just about to tell. And then we want to hear from you about kind of how you think things are on the ground up there in the heartlands. You're in the heartlands there, right, in Kansas City, Mo. We'll talk about that in a second. But let's get to the goods. What happened this afternoon, guys?
Well, just about the Supreme Court, it's not clear to me if the Mexican Supreme Court, that is, if they are going to still vote for the Ministro de Justice González Alcántara Carrancá, and if this was only this determination was about only like determined to get those 8 votes. But I mean, it is a start. I do want to say that I believe that it's just a battle, but many other battles are in front of us. This morning, the Congresswoman Margarita Zavala told Vicente Serrano outside of the Supreme Court that they are preparing so many other challenges to the judicial reform, which is not a reform anymore. It's
Constitution.
But she warned that Acción Nacional, Partido de Acción Nacional Party, which is, for those who don't know, our neo-Nazi party. It is like it was founded on the neo-Nazi principles, on the Nazi principles. It was like actually founded,
right? 1939.
Yeah, it was founded 15 days after Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. Hitler invaded Poland in September the 1st of 1939, and in the celebration of Mexican independence, Acción Nacional was founded with all these like principles, like fascist principles. But anyway, they're like warning that the more challenges are coming to the now constitutional right Mexicans have to elect judges and other judicial figures. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a win for now, but more problems are in near future.
I mean, it's a struggle. This is a political fight, and I think you really summed it up by saying that. But I think we should celebrate the victories when they come. I wasn't sure how things were going to go. I mean, obviously, in the lead up to all of this, we saw that 8 ministers had actually said that they would resign, which kind of gave us a clue that these 8 ministers were not in favor of the judicial reform. But then there was the surprise. Perez Dayan ended up deciding that he would not support this gross violation of Mexican democracy. He would not allow this precedent to be set, which I think is really important. The very first test, I think, this first effort to say we are going to stop at nothing to try to impede the legislative agenda, the constitutional agenda of Morena and its allies, of the forced transformation of President Sheinbaum, failed. I think that's really important to highlight. And of course, not forget the fact that Mexico is very close to being a pioneer in the world. Never has a country this big tried to do what we're trying to do here, which is that the last remaining unelected branch of government will now be elected by the people. And I think a lot of it was also, the opposition to this was informed by a fear of that. Not just because of the corruption, not just because of people wanting to protect their privilege, but there is a fear that if you give the people the ability to do this, it might set an example for the rest of the region, for maybe even the world. And so I think them losing in this point is really worth celebrating. And they were very, very close to engaging in some very, very unscrupulous behavior. At one point, the court was actually trying to decide if they needed 8 votes out of 11 or 6 votes out of 11.
Well, this was the silliest thing, wasn't it?
Which is incredible. And I was going to ask you, Kurt, what do you make of this? What does this tell us? The fact that they were willing to entertain, ultimately it didn't happen, but they were willing to entertain this notion of actually changing the rules, that with only 6 votes, 6 people, they could destroy what the population voted for and demanded and was followed through on by the government. What do you make of this, Kurt? What does it tell us that they even flirted with this idea?
Remember in last week's episode, Jose Luis, in the losers and haters section, when we talked about the estimated PhD was Ryan Berg, and you pulled out the I made it up meme, the I made it up, right? He just said he made a table based on his own stuff he pulled out of his sleeve. This is what the Supreme Court has shown repeatedly. They're willing to just make shit up, right? Carranca in his text said, yes, I know we can't go be above the Constitution. I know we can't say that constitutional amendments are unconstitutional, but upon a new reflection, basically I made it up, that part isn't Constitution. It's just federal electoral law. So we can toss it aside. So that was in the actual ruling. And this is when Perez Dayan, showing a degree of, principle. Remember, Perez Dayan is a conservative judge. He was nominated by Calderon, right? What's ironic is that the person who wrote this ridiculous text, Alcántara Carranca, was nominated by AMLO. He was nominated by AMLO, right? And then betrayed everything, right? But it was the AMLO nominee who wrote this ridiculous text, and it was the Calderon judge who stood up and said, "This is no." He said, "I tried to convince myself of this, but I can't." He said he wasn't in agreement with the judicial reform, which is fine. He said it was an insensatez. That's his opinion. But he said you can't replace one insensatez with another insensatez, right? Fine. If that's the way he wants to, make his logic, that's his prerogative. So he came out and said, I'm not going to vote for this. And so that's when it became very clear that 8-vote block had fallen apart. And it's interesting that last week at a press conference in the Congress, Alito Moreno, the president of the PRI, was like, who's going to be the Judas? Who's going to be the traitor? Who's it going to be? It's like he was already foreseeing that somebody was going to bail on them. It was Perez Dayan. Who had previously, and all these videos were being shared in Twitter of Perez Dayan specifically saying you can't go above the Constitution. They were sharing videos of Perez Dayan in these days. They were sharing videos of Margarita Rios Farhat, another AMLO nominee, saying the same thing in recent days. So once it became clear that they'd lost their 8, because to rule something unconstitutional in Mexico, you need a qualified majority in the Supreme Court. They can't do it anyway. But to even try, you needed 8 votes out of 11. So then you got some Norma Pina getting all kind of huffy and kind of trying to pressure Perez Dayan right there. So that wasn't working. So then she really goes nuclear. She did the nuclear option. And the nuclear option was, I'm going to change the rules right in a minute. Right while we're talking, I'm going to change the rules. Like kids on the playground. And now we don't need 8 votes anymore. We need 6. Why? Because I said so. Because the new judicial reform says there's only going to be 9 members of the Supreme Court, so we need fewer votes. So the parts of the judicial reform we like, we're going to use. The parts we don't like, we're going to rule against. At the same time. At the same time. We're going to use this part, but this part we're going to, it's just like, oh, just a mess. And then there was basically rebellion against her saying, you've gone too far. You've gone too far. Even you. It's too far for even us. That you're trying to change the rules of how many votes you need at the same moment that we're voting. It's like, new rule. New rule. And she lost. That's what happened today. You know, it couldn't happen to a worse person, but it was really just ridiculous that she tried to change the rules in the moment. And I think it vindicates, just to conclude on this point, Claudia Sheinbaum's strategy to not impeach them, to not go for the impeachment, the juicio político. Sheinbaum's idea was to let them fall on their own sword and let them make a fool of themselves, and not do it for them and let them look like martyrs. And they did. And I think Scheinbaum was vindicated in that, Jose Luis.
Yeah, and I threw up here on a couple of tweets here. It was evident to me anyway, and I think to others, that she was really upset. She was not happy. She even scolded people at the end there because they got up from their chairs a little bit too fast. She's like, the session hasn't ended. I'm sorry, I throw this up there. Please don't put in the newspaper that I got mad. I'm not mad. And clearly she is. So, Antonio, I was actually going to turn it to you and ask you, what does this mean in terms of the opposition strategy? So they lost the election by a huge margin. They're unable to really have much influence in the legislature. They resorted to these kinds of coup-mongering guerrilla tactics. And I had this other one while he was talking here, where we have them now calling them Perez Dayan traitors. You know, they're threatening to lynch the guy for not voting with him. So what's next for the Mexican opposition after this defeat?
I think it's gonna be like just face Sheinbaum and her government, but in the international battleground. You see, I am quite sure that the judicial power was the last thing the opposition had in Mexico, Jose Luis and Kurt. Yeah. In other countries in Latin America, they always resort also to the judicial power for their coups or the technical coups, or just like the notebook kind of coup d'etat. Nevertheless, Mexico, just like the United States, has a presidentialist system in which the president of Mexico is also the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And I was also reflecting on this with our friend Eddie Small yesterday. No, this morning, I'm sorry, on how those ministers and the whole judicial power right now don't have like anything anymore. They don't have the recognition of, obviously, these ministers. They don't have the support of the armed forces. Just like it may happen, I don't know, in Peru or sometimes in Bolivia, they have nothing. They have absolutely nothing right now, and they don't have anything to bargain with. So I think what's going to happen right now is that we're going to see a lot of attacks from outside. We're going to keep seeing these trash pieces in the New York Times in which they interview these poor ministers that have been cheated, according to the corporate media here. We're going to still see columns written by disgusting former presidents of Mexico, like that mommy called Ernesto Zedillo. And this is going to be only with the intention of comparing Claudia Sheinbaum with Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez, the late Hugo Chavez, and also right now with Nicolas Maduro. But right now, I don't think this very, very funny opposition has anything to fight with. It was the last thing they had was the judicial power, and right now I'm like convinced they're gonna be just with these kind of messages. I don't know if you already read what Lito Moreno precisely wrote in Twitter after the decision in the Supreme Court. He said, "Today is a dark day for our country. The betrayal of Minister Alberto Pérez Dayan prevented the invalidity of the harmful Reforma al Poder Judicial for being declared, blurring the division of powers, the rule of law, and the judicial career. This opens the way to a country where decisions are made by a single person." That sounds like PRI, right? Like they sound like the Revolutionary Institutional Party of Mexico. He says, "The PRI members will continue to fight for the freedoms of Mexicans, and we will go to the international bodies to denounce what is happening in Mexico. This is not over." And I mean, I wish them luck. I wish them luck, because I'm quite sure when they go to the Hague or whatever, they're gonna like laugh in their faces, right? Like they're gonna be like, I mean, this was determined by the people of Mexico. We don't see any kind of irregularity here. So can we say profanity in this show?
Oh yeah,
we'd probably avoid it.
Well, go F yourself. They're gonna tell Alito.
That's what we use. Yeah, I have here on the screen the reaction from Salinas Pliego, a Mexican member of the Mexican bourgeoisie. Saying, here, warning before the result came out, everyone pay attention. Here is where democracy either lives or dies, right? Or we'll have to resist. And that's kind of the language we've been getting from, as you just said, from Alito Moreno and all this kind of stuff. I'm wondering if maybe now is a good time to have a conversation, to switch gears a little bit here, because we're talking about, and seeing a comment here in the chat as well. The opposition will probably use foreign intervention to prevent the 4T. So maybe it's time for us to switch gears here and talk a little bit about the U.S. election and what it could mean. But before we do that, I want to make sure I give a chance to both Kurt and Antonio to a final few words here on the judicial reform and the defeat of the Supreme Court coup attempt today.
Yeah, so a couple of points before we shift gears over to what's happening up there in Norte. It's interesting to see who's upset, because that's very indicative, right? Alito Moreno is upset because he's the former supremely corrupt governor of Campeche, and you saw him up in the Senate the other day, almost physically attacking Gerardo Fernandez Noroña, because he's on the point of losing his political immunity so that he can be put on trial where he deserves to be. He deserves to be. He knows he won't be able to count on his buddies in the judiciary anymore. So he's upset. Fine. Salinas Pliego, you just put on the screen, is a legendary tax dodger. He owes up to $3 billion to the Mexican tax office in back taxes, right? Some 60 billion pesos. Plus, he's just, been screwing U.S. investors out of another couple $100 million of bonds that he's decided, just not going to pay back, with the help of Mexico's judicial branch. So that's why they're doing this. So he's upset. So it's nice to see the criminals and the tax dodgers and the elites and the oligarchs be upset at this. That's when you know that this is a really important reform and not just a cosmetic change. And I think this speaks to a larger point, which we've talked a lot about in the podcast. You can't be naive about what it means to wield power. It's been talked about a lot that sometimes the left doesn't understand that you can be in government, but not in power. You can be in government, but not in power. And if you don't attack the entrenched power centers, you're either going to lose, or you're going to be subject to lawfare, or they're going to block you or destroy you. And I think Morena in Mexico has learned the lessons of a lot of South American countries, that you can't be naive about what it means to hold and wield power. And this is why you see so many wealthy and powerfully connected people so upset about this judicial reform.
Well, I believe that, this was a much needed reform for Mexico. It was something that people were asking for, that were demanding during the whole López Obrador sexenio. It's so funny that they don't have a word for sexenio. My wife loves the word sexenio. During the whole term for López Obrador.
6-year term, it's all, yeah.
Yeah, I know, right? But anyway, I mean, for a long time, the president, the former president Lopez Obrador, uh, gave the judicial power to reform itself. He said, like, no, no, no. I remember because I would cover the mañaneras for like so often, and they he would always say, you know what? Yes, maybe the judicial power needs a reform, but it's not too the same judicial power. Then Minister Saldivar, Arturo Saldivar, became the minister president of the Mexican Supreme Court, and he tried to do some changes, but it was just like Kurt said, only cosmetic changes, and not uh, uh, dealing with the real problem, which was definitely like thinking about just an open surgery, speaking about the horrible things the judicial power does in Mexico. I don't know if you guys know. I mean, obviously you do as journalists, but maybe our audience don't. In Mexico, most of the people I believe in our jails are poor people that wouldn't be able to
Yeah.
pay for a good lawyer that could get them out of jail with no problem. Mexico also has a lot of corruption within its judicial power, with all these judges, magistrates, and ministers. They there is a lot of nepotism with the whole apparatus of the judicial power. So it was like a much needed reform, a much wanted and demanded reform by the Mexican people. And obviously, this is like definitely a success and a triumph for the people. But I still want to warn that it's just the beginning of the problems. They're gonna still try to contest and oppose this reform with anything they have in their like reach. Nevertheless, they're gonna fail. I'm sure of that. Like, it's going to be another failure for the opposition, and yeah, I mean, I think that this is the beginning of a real transformation in Mexico, of a real revolution. Lopez Obrador would set the foundation for it. Right now, we're gonna see definitely the transformation of Mexico.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the things that I always tried to emphasize when we talked about the judicial reform is that you have to take out the conservative strongholds. You have to take away these spaces where they can impede the will of the Mexican population, which clearly favors Morena and its legislative priorities and the government's priorities. And so I think this is a major, major blow to the forces that conspire. I don't want to say the opposition, because I think there's the political opposition, but then there's the opposition more broadly in society, right? These conservative forces that don't want to see any of this happen, that totally reject, you know, everything we've seen in the last 6 years in terms of investment in the population, a reconfiguration of the state, direct cash transfer programs, shifting away from needs-based, merit-based programs to universal social programs, the pensions, expanding healthcare and health access, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a lot of people who want to return to the old Mexico as a source of cheap labor, as a source of cheap natural resources, where wages were deliberately suppressed so as to facilitate higher profits, be it for the Mexican bourgeoisie or, foreign investors who are seeking to exploit. So I'm going to use that as the segue to talk about the next topic that we're here. And, I think we'll start with you, Antonio. Like, tell us what's the mood in the United States? Obviously, I don't think I need to say it. U.S. election day. Gosh, it feels like election cycles never end in the United States these days. Like usually they start and end, but it's like as soon as this one's over, the next one's going to start. But as we know, it's been a long, long, long campaign period. Finally getting to these election day when we won't know tonight probably, but we'll have an idea of where the population's at. But I'd love to hear from you. What's your sense of the mood of voters? What are people feeling like? Turnout, all the rest of it, all the lovely stuff when it comes to elections.
Jose Luis, dear Kurt, and dear audience, I believe that I speak for many of Americans, many Mexican Americans, from any kind of party, any kind of ideology. and I could say that we want this to be over already.
No.
It's been a very difficult election. It's not the election of our lives, like Elon Musk and Donald Trump says, but it is a very maybe one of the most difficult elections the United States have faced. It. I think the feeling is just constant anguish about the result. Uh, they are like projecting, as always, in the main corporate media, that Kamala Harris will win this election. Nevertheless, you know, polls have been wrong before, and the problem here, the problem everybody is aware of, is how close the result is going to be. If Donald Trump wins, we think that maybe I do believe that the Democratic Party and Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, her whole campaign, are gonna definitely concede and accept the results. But if Trump loses for a very close margin, we're gonna see another January the 6th, 2021 incident, another coup d'état in the United States. So people are worried from both parties. People are worried from like a both. I mean, yeah, no, like the most people are. I would say would be worried. They're like people that always love chaos and confrontation, and they think this is a wrestling match. But I do think that there's like a lot of anguish right now, a lot of us looking at our phones and just wondering if this nightmare is over, and then we can get rid of the orange orangutan once and for all, or we're gonna get again uh, 4 years of, if I may say so, um, you know, like hypocrisy and policies that pretend to be liberal, but they're like way on the right. So yeah, it's a whole mess, and we're all worried about it.
I know I saw a lot of commentary from people saying that no matter what the result is, whether Harris wins, whether Trump wins, is basically going to represent a rightward shift, right? Because if Trump wins, well, we all know what he represents. But if Harris wins, well, she's basically run an entire campaign aimed at Republicans, not at Democrats, not at their own base. Kurt, you made this observation during your appearance on Canal Once a couple of days ago, right? The Democrats abandoned the working class space. So, you know, I think it's bad news in terms of people who believe in progressive policies, you know, those of us who sympathize with the left, that no matter what the results, one of the two right-wing parties is going to win tonight, although we won't know the result for a while. I wanted to just jump in here when the comments around the polls. I think it's been interesting. You know, some people are they seem to have been scared by what happened in 2016. You know, there every pollster was saying Hillary Clinton's going to win. She has an above 90% chance in all of our scenarios. I was looking up some other ones a couple of days ago, and you know, the scenarios are like 50-50. It's a toss-up. Everyone you look, it's all a toss-up. And I think because they're afraid of the same thing happening again. But there's also a truth to it, which is that, you know, there is a very sharp divide amongst those who participate in U.S. electoral politics. And I was hoping maybe, Kurt, you could jump in on this one here as someone, I know you're more Mexican than gringo these days, but, you know, what have your friends and family based in the U.S. have been telling you in terms of that sense of polarization in the United States and how that will manifest today in the election?
You know, it's interesting. I've been thinking about this. I kind of with the idea of Tonya, we just want this all to be over. You know? But you know, I grew up in Connecticut, and small town Connecticut, and my mother was always a Republican, always voted GOP, and because of Trump, she's now started voting Democratic. So this is kind of symptomatic of where the Democratic Party has gone. It's lost its working class base, you know, in large part because it's abandoning of, you know, the New Deal coalition, and it's picked up more people in the suburbs, you know, more college-educated people in the suburbs, which has made it a more conservative party, right? So, and you know, older people like, you know, my mother, who will now vote because she hates Trump will vote Democratic. But at the same time, they've lost, people like my grandmother, who was, an Italian immigrant, grew up poor in Hartford, and she voted for the Democratic Party. It wasn't, you wouldn't do anything else for the Italian community. They would vote Democratic. That's what you did. So, it's no longer the Democratic Party has always been part of the imperial machine. Don't get me wrong, but it's not the Democratic Party of my grandmother. It's more now the Democratic Party of my mother, who is a longtime Republican and who is, started voting Democratic because of her hatred for Trump. But at the same time, you see more African Americans voting Republican. You see somewhat more Latinos voting for Republicans, and you see, working class people who have to face precarious working conditions, huge wealth disequality, problems with health care, people in the streets, homelessness. Absolutely no offer from the Democratic Party on this. No offer for these people who have faced the worst of the precarious economy. Nothing to say to them. Nothing. Right? Who, out of their anger, have turned, to the fake populism of Trump. Not to mention, the college students who are suspended for protesting Gaza, the Arab Americans, and anybody with principle who stands against the U.S. war machine everywhere in the world. The U.S. war machine everywhere in the world that both parties want to continue wholeheartedly. Right? And that means Europe, that means the Middle East, that means the Pacific. The war machine rolls on here. So the polarization is, it's a country that's very clearly stuck and frustrated in a bipartisan straitjacket. So that's why you see record numbers of people identifying as independents, right? Much more now independents than Republicans and Democrats. People casting around for other options, be it the Green Party, be it the Socialist Liberation Party, be it other independent candidates, an anti-imperialist, anti-militarist option, and seeing how the two-party system works to ruthlessly shunt aside any attempt at a third party or another option. Just ruthlessly about that, keeping them off the ballot, keeping them out of the debates, preventing them from getting financing, dirty tricks. Right? Even today in Ohio, there were signs posted that Jill Stein had dropped out of the race when she hadn't. Just nonsense stuff like that. Now, with regards to Mexico, which I think is what is really important for us here, and then maybe we can look at some of the results. I put on Twitter today something that's very important to me, because in Mexico, there's sometimes this question that comes up of who's going to be better for Mexico, Trump or Harris? Trump or Harris? Who's going to be better for Mexico? And that's a very passive way of looking at it. Like, we can't do anything. We just have to hope that we have the lesser of two evils. And, this show is called Soberanía for a reason. The idea is that Mexico has to continue along its path of sovereignty, of soberanía, so that it can deal with whoever comes up. Because whoever comes up is going to be a representative of the empire in one way or another. And it's either going to be showboaty and, a lot of blather like Trump, or it's going to be more kind of insistent like this, like the Democrats and Ken Salazar. But it's still imperialism one way or another, with one mask or another. So Mexico has to take kind of this active approach to the question and say, what do we need to do to continue along the sovereign path so that we can deal with whoever comes up, right? Because even if Trump wins, Trump is not going to be able to do the kind of tariffs that he's threatening he's going to do. It's a different world now. It's a multipolar world, and the dollar is losing its tread as the world reserve currency. And if he starts slapping tariffs around, there's going to be counter tariffs. And the U.S. isn't a manufacturing economy, and it doesn't make its own goods anymore. It's dependent on imports. It's dependent on imports. It's dependent on Mexican imports. It's dependent on the integration with Mexico. So, Mexico can't be intimidated by this stuff. It cannot be intimidated by this stuff because it's all rhetoric. They want Mexico to cave in before they even do anything. So I think that has to be really pointed out, and that Mexico has a lot more options on its plate than it used to have.
I saw your tweet about that, about reframing the way that we approach this, and I think it really resonated with a lot of people. I saw I get a lot of engagement. And I think that is absolutely what our starting point is, because ultimately, I don't think there is going to be much difference depending on who wins. Obviously, there is a huge difference between the candidates, and I don't want to be, misquoted on this. But I think ultimately in the bilateral relationship, right, what predominates is the U.S. foreign policy security priorities. And so those will be the ones that determine the US Mexico relationship. And that means, what are we going to do about it? Like you said, right? What is going to be our response to whoever wins? And I think that's ultimately, and actually there were similar comments from President Maduro today saying that, it's not really us to say, oh, we prefer this or that. And of course, Claudia, similarly in the morning press conference, was very, very careful to say, no, I'm not taking sides. I'm not saying one or the other. But we need to privilege, Mexican sovereignty, Mexican interests. And I wanted to share with you something I wrote for the Mexican Solidarity Project Bulletin about the two candidates. If you'll indulge me for a second here. And I wrote the following. On the one hand, you have Donald Trump, a candidate threatening to take a hardline position on organized crime groups in Mexico by designating them foreign terrorist organizations by virtue of the 1996 Anti-Terrorism Act. The proposal is actually an old idea, having been first floated by the US Congress in 2011, but one that has found greater currency in recent years given the fentanyl crisis in the US. Trump intended to follow through on this idea in his first term, only abandoning it thanks to shrewd negotiating by then Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador and his government. Analysts have warned that Trump will be less restrained should he secure a second term. This foreign terrorist organization designation will serve as a precursor to unilateral military action by the U.S. inside Mexico against so-called drug cartels. This bellicose strategy could include drone strikes or even kill teams covertly sent into the country to assassinate drug kingpins, all without Mexico's approval. In addition to being an unacceptable and gross violation of Mexico's sovereignty, it would also do virtually nothing to improve the situation faced by people and their families wrestling with addictions inside the United States, and do little to stem the supply of illicit drugs. The alternative, as represented by Kamala Harris, is hardly any better for Mexico. Under the Biden-Harris administration, Washington has been at odds with Mexico City over the latter's refusal to give U.S. agents the free reign inside Mexico that they previously enjoyed. Under López Obrador, Mexico severely limited the scope of the work of the DA, grounding their plane and placing more restrictions on heavier scrutiny on agents, with Director Ann Milgram even lamenting the slow pace of visa approval. And President Claudia Sheinbaum has continued this strategy, pledging cooperation without submission. But the strongest evidence that Democrats have the same disdain for Mexican sovereignty as their Republican counterparts came earlier this year when the notorious drug kingpin Ismael El Mayo Zambada was mysteriously whisked away to the United States and arrested at a private airfield in Texas in what Mexican Attorney General Alejandro Gertz Manero described as a kidnapping. It's been 3 months since Zambada was arrested, believed to have been betrayed by Joaquin Guzman Lopez, the son of El Chapo, yet the U.S. has still not fully explained how the operation went down, nor the U.S. government's role. So there we have one candidate who's proposing to engage in unilateral military action against Mexico, who engaged in very harmful decisions and bully tactics when he was in office. And we have the other one who served in a government that similarly totally disregarded Mexican sovereignty. So, Antonio, I'll turn it over to you in terms of what do you feel about the fact that in a lot of ways, when it comes to foreign policy in the United States, it doesn't matter who wins.
You know what, Jose Luis, Kurt, and your audience, I I do think there are main differences between the policies of one candidate, one ideology, and the other. Yes, of course, we have seen in this Biden-Harris administration a lot of McCarthyism in their policies. I think, unfortunately, the Department of State still lives in the McCarthyism era. I don't know why, but they still have like these very weird and outdated ideas, and they are always so scared of the communism ghost. Like they're always so scared of the left and the radical left. And the same Donald Trump considers Kamala Harris and Joe Biden Marxist-Leninists, he's always like this is a true offense. But I do think that even when we're talking about the same imperialism of always, I do see that there is a main difference in the Trump campaign and in the whole Trump apparatus. Like the people that are behind him with Project 2025, for example, and the whole anti-Mexican feeling. I do believe that Donald Trump hates us. Like he hates us. He despises us as Mexicans. We saw it last night when he said that we are invaders here. We're invaders in this country. We Mexican Americans. He believed that he says Mexico is invading the United States. He wonders why Mexico it's the main commercial partner of the United States, and he says that he's gonna change this. Whereas you get the Biden-Harris administration, they're like more than happy that do some business with Mexico, even with all the things you already mentioned, Jose Luis, these attacks under the table towards the Lopez Obrador administration. But I do see that it's more ideological. This hate, this anti-Mexican feeling with Trump and his followers, with Trump and his the people behind his campaign and his whole ideology. I do see it, and I know I don't want to go to a common place, but I do see that Donald Trump is definitely a danger for Mexicans here in the United States and for Mexico in general. Uh, just because he wants to satisfy his political platform, first of all, a political platform that I insist they see this election and they see these differences between Mexico and the United States as a wrestling match or as a football game. They like there's this very childish conception of the whole politics of the United States and the difference we have with other countries. So I think it is very, very dangerous to have Trump again in the White House. Now, speaking about the Republican Party, I think the worst player here is definitely the Republicans. The Republicans that historically were pro-immigrant, and not because they love immigrants, it's because just as the father of neoliberalism, Milton Friedman, said once, undocumented folks are very good for a very capitalistic country, for a country that bases its policies in neoliberalism, because undocumented people, contrary to popular belief, do pay their taxes. The IRS makes sure that you pay your taxes. The ones who don't pay their taxes are the billionaires like Donald Trump. But everybody in the United States pay their taxes. Here, undocumented folks would be able to pay their taxes with two forms. They would forfeit their social security number, or they use this concept that the IRS has that is called the IT number. There's some kind of a provisional number for international workers. So everybody pays taxes, and Trump and his followers are constantly saying, yeah, no, they're taking all our social benefits. I always ask, what benefits? What benefits do we have here in the United States? What social benefits do we have? I don't know one person that uses food food coupons. Like seriously, you have seen the healthcare system is is terrible. No, it makes us pay a lot of money for our own insurance. And don't let me go into the education in the United States, the whole how they are right now trying to privatize education with charter schools that will be able to kick out their students if they do want to. So I always wonder what kind of social benefits that the undocumented immigrants are taking, the Trump followers are talking about. Like seriously, I don't know. I do think, and I don't want to sound like Alito Moreno, but I think that the real traitors here are the Republican Party, a Republican Party that just saw an opportunity to get getting get the power, taking the most basic and the most limited concept in politics. A concept that it has been used since democracy was invented in ancient Greece, um, xenophobia and the the ability uh, to um, to blame your neighbors of your own problems. It's like it's something that goes within us as humans. So I mean, it's just like I do have this feeling against the Republican Party for how they have been dealing with this whole Trump drama, but also with the Democratic Party. I don't know if you guys know, but this recent anti-immigrant sentiment started with Bill Clinton.
Of course.
With Bill Clinton, when he was the main prosecutor of Arkansas, then he became governor of Arkansas. He stated so many policies against immigrants, and this new wave of anti-immigrant laws and anti-immigrant policies became a reality in Clinton's term. That was like an undeniable fact that it was the Democrats who started this new anti-immigrant sentiment.
Because of
It was,
NAFTA, right? They knew
yeah,
exactly what NAFTA was going to cause immigrant flows. So it was Clinton who was there, militarizing the border from the
right,
get-go, well aware of what NAFTA was going to provoke.
right, and also uh, we do have to think about how all these guys are connected. I don't want to sound like one of those cuckoo conspirators, like those people who love conspiracy theories. But uh, Bill Clinton would be playing golf with Donald Trump so many times. They're friends. They I don't know now, but in the past they love each other, and I mean they have so many things in common.
The
So
Clintons were at his wedding.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, one of
It's
his
a small club, and you're not part of it, to quote George Carlin.
right, right. So anyway, I mean, uh, uh, we do have to like I am quite terrified of what's gonna happen, one way or another. It's also immoral I mean, it's immoral what the Biden Harris administration is doing, in my opinion, regarding the genocide in the Gaza Strip and other territories like um, uh, um, the West Bank. I think it is both candidates are the worst of the worst, and as we say in Spanish, we're voting for el menos el peor, and as they say in my little town, el menos peor, right? So it's like it's a nightmare. It's definitely
Yeah.
a nightmare.
And it's hard to know who is el menos peor, who's the least evil in this one. And I know that's been part of the conversation as well. And I think you made a really good point that we should definitely emphasize here, which is that of course we want to emphasize the Mexico-U.S. relationship. I think Claudia faces a tall order if Trump wins, mainly because he's a huge machista and he doesn't respect women. And I think that's going to be a major issue. Interestingly enough, he actually had a bit of a positive relationship with López Obrador. He actually respected López Obrador, and I think that helped to kind of calm some of the tensions there. I don't think he'll take the same tack if it is Claudia. I think we have to say that out loud. And oddly enough, Harris actually in an interview was asked, like, "Oh, what do you know about the new Mexican president?" She's like, "Oh, I was talking to her." She was actually kind of enthusiastic. She's like, "Did you know she's a scientist?" So you can tell that she, would be probably at least at the interpersonal level a little bit better. But the point I was going to make, which is that we can't forget what these results can mean for our paisanos in the United States, right? I think Trump is pretty serious when he talks about mass deportations. I actually think that he will do everything he can to actually follow through on that should he win. And that means a lot of people with or without status are going to be affected by. Families are going to get destroyed, And so I think it's really important to highlight what this can mean. And I think, there's a place there for, voices inside Mexico, political voices, leadership here to step up and actually do something to defend the interests of the Mexican population and the rest of the migrant population, but obviously attending, Mexicans in a particular special way, because they do, they continue to be part of Mexico despite living abroad. And I think that's going to be a pretty serious thing. Kurt, I wanted to turn it over to you if you want to jump in here on the conversation. Yeah. In the meantime, I'm going to start putting some results up here on the screen, and maybe we can have a conversation about where things are painting. I don't think we're going to have enough by the time we wrap up here, but maybe we can start to think about what we may make up to tomorrow. But go take it away.
So, a few points on this very interesting conversation, gentlemen. First of all, with regards to Trump and his, machismo and his, disdain for women, Rafa over in the comments makes an interesting one. Hi, Rafa. He says, "Good evening. I'm certain if it gets to that, President Scheinbaum will be able to deal with Trump as a teacher does with an unruly child." So. Which I thought was a really good comment. Nobody's rooting for a Trump victory. But, it's funny that throughout the Mexican campaign, this whole idea was that Scheinbaum isn't her own person. She's a shadow of López Obrador. She's a puppet of López Obrador. He's going to be the puppeteer behind, the throne. He's going to be pulling the strings. She's charisma free. She has, she's wooden. She's this and that. Well, look at her in her first month, huh? Look at how she runs those mañaneras. Look at how she runs her ship. Journalists who would attack López Obrador much more ferociously, because there was a lot more back and forth, and López Obrador loved to debate people. She shuts them down. She doesn't have to yell. She just has this, very professional demeanor and just brooking no shit. Right? Not even like the people who usually go on for hours, like Reina there in the press conference. They're all just kind of a lot quieter there. So there's been a lot of underestimating of how Scheinbaum can deal with things. And I think the flip side of Trump's machismo is I think he probably won't be able to deal with that kind of situation if it gets to that as comfortably. He won't be able to use the same old tropes and the same old blather and the same old this, because, Claudia doesn't fall for that. She certainly hasn't fallen for it with the Supreme Court. She certainly hasn't, she's been withering about the Supreme Court. She's been withering about their coup attempt. She's been really good in the mañaneras. And at the same time, she hasn't overreacted, and she's kept her powder dry and has kind of let them make a fool of themselves over there. So she's played chess. So, with regards to President Scheinbaum, I'm not particularly worried about that. Mm-hmm. Now, with regards to what you were saying about the paisanos in the United States, that's a very real threat that we have to be very, very concerned about. And the Democrats have to share their part of the blame in this, right? Tonio mentioned how, a lot of the current border policy dates back to the Clinton administration, and it dates back to, the immigration flows they know they were going to be causing by NAFTA. We know Obama being the deporter in chief, right? Then we know, AOC going and crying at the border, and her big dramatic pictures. But then the Biden administration has largely maintained the Trumpian border policies, largely. Right, with some differences, but and the bipartisan border bill, which Harris championed, is a really punitive bill. It's a very punitive bill. It's more border agents, it's more border technology. A lot of Israeli companies involved in that because that's their specialty. Right, it's basically the same kind of asylum policy that you can only apply for asylum at recognized border checkpoints. Otherwise, you can't. If you cross in a non-standard border checkpoint, you can't request asylum. It includes the provision there that they can basically seal the border if there are too many migrants, basically declare a border emergency and stop asylum petitions completely. More power to ICE, which is the agency tasked with doing these roundups, who already has a terrible amount of power. So she was against the wall, and now she's for it. It's depressing how much to the right, specifically the immigration debate, has lurched since the 2020 election. It's very depressing. At least back then, the Democrats talked about a comprehensive route to citizenship. They at least talked about it. They weren't ever very serious about it, and they didn't ever spend a lot of political capital on it, but they talked about it. Up until even the midterm elections, they were still talking about it. That's gone. That's gone. That was gone from this year's campaign. There was a very narrow route to citizenship for the dreamers who've been there for a long time and fulfill certain requirements. But a comprehensive route to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented, that's fallen off the map. So it's like the whole thing that the Republicans lurch right and then it doesn't lurch left again. It kind of stops and it lurches right farther, and it's like that whole, so it keeps going this way. Right. And so Gloria Ayala says our options here are very limited regarding the choose to vote. Republicans, Democrats is very much similar to what Toño was saying. It's por el peor o el menos peor, or as Toño says, peor. So my question, I guess, would be, before we look at some results, or maybe after we look at some results, what can be done within the United States to start shifting the immigration debate, not even towards the left, because that would be a pipe dream at this point, but at least towards some kind of rational, at least some kind of a sane immigration argument. I go back home to Connecticut, and my brother-in-law, who I respect very much and is a very good guy, believes this idea that immigrants are crossing the border and voting in elections. I'm like, that's not happening. But that's the extent to which this has gotten all just kind of crazy. They believe that illegal immigrants are voting in droves. You can't just believe this stuff. How can we bring it back to at least to some kind of sane debate in the United States? It seems like it's just spiraling out of control at the same time that the empire spirals out of control, in the Middle East, in Europe, in the Pacific. It's like the whole debate at home, all of the, the militarization that the United States has fostered abroad comes home to roost, and that really hits the immigration debate specifically.
I certainly don't have an answer. I don't have an answer every time.
I don't expect anyone to, because it's a tough one. But I want to put that out there, because I go home and I talk to people who have very sane views on other things, and then you bring up immigration and you see how far the immigration has lost. That debate has gotten lost over the last 4 years. I mean, really has gone, way to the right.
I do want to say that maybe this is because of what I was reflecting on with you guys before, just like human nature of blaming others of our own mistakes, and that's why it's so sexy for politics to use it against or to use it on their own favor. That's why it's so easy for them, so basic for them to just like recur to the anti-immigration feeling, and I think that's that's the reality. But as a new citizen, I do want to tell our audience that and maybe because there's someone out there thinking that immigrants can come into this country and vote without being citizens. It's impossible. It's impossible. You have to be a citizen. You have to prove that you're a citizen in order to vote. I haven't ever seen any kind of proof that immigrants were voting for one or another candidate. It's just, that's insane. That's crazy. But just as Kurt says, it is something that immediately say oh yeah, those immigrants, this and that. Happens in every family, and I think it is just something within us as humanity. This very basic instinct about just trying to avoid our own responsibility on any kind of matter by blaming the neighbor with our own mistakes, right?
Yeah, the one thing I would add is that I think what we've seen is not just a shift to the right, which is very evident to anybody paying attention, but the way that fascist ideas have actually openly fascist ideas, and I think that's very much tied to the way that we've seen this discussion change when it comes to migration, right? The point you make about people thinking that the country's being invaded and all of these migrants that are coming through the southern border are going to be able to vote. It's a conspiracy theory. right? It has no basis in the truth. It's people have led themselves to believe this because it's part of the fascist ideology, like that Antonio's pointing to, right? The you know, war is elsewhere. You are safe here, but we have to build these walls to keep the hordes out. That's a classic feature of fascist ideas, and I think Trump may not be someone who accepts being a fascist, kind of, but I think there's more than one voice out there, especially recently, pointing out that I think this guy actually qualifies as such. And so I think as long as Trump is part of the national political discourse, we're going to see this continued shift to the right. And also, obviously, much of the blame also goes to the Democrats who've allowed it to shift that way, right? I remember the beginning of Biden's term where he promised amazing things for migrants, a path to citizenship, protecting dreamers, comprehensive immigration reform. And then he ended up doing what Kurt said, which is that basically applying the Republican program about shutting down the border. I watch a lot of American football. Our viewers will know this. And then sometimes I'll cite the fact that I pirate the streams. Well, I guess come after me, NFL. And so I always get the U.S. commercials. I get the U.S. commercials as opposed to the Mexican commercials. And so many of the ads are the Democrats saying, well, we passed a tough border bill and the Republicans voted against it. I mean, that's extraordinary. You adopted their rhetoric, you've adopted their positions, and you're actually saying that you're to the right of the Republicans on this. I mean, that's part of, I think, why the debate has shifted as much as it has. And to tie it back to Mexico, right? I agree with Antonio when he talks about the fact that there is almost like an inclination to agree with somebody who's telling you that the problem is elsewhere. You need to blame other people, but it has very serious consequences for Mexico. And I'll close my comments on this, and we'll go to the results right after this. But Trump launches his campaign talking about Mexicans being rapists and murderers, and I sustain that he was able to secure the nomination and win the presidency, 2 cycles ago, because of that statement. Because he woke something up in that racist, xenophobic part of the Republican Party that was like, yeah, this is our guy. He says the quiet part out loud. And they got the whole Trump cult really started to cultivate from that moment. But that's only effective to a point. And I think when people realize that, what he's saying isn't exactly true, you have to ramp it up. And that's why we've seen him talk about unilateral military action, about sending kill teams into Mexico. I did a couple of speaking tours in the United States, and there's a lot of people there who do sincerely feel like they're being invaded. And so they're like, well, we should be able to invade back. Mexico's not doing its job. They're letting all the migrants in. And so it would be okay if we invaded them, right? The way that this rhetoric, this painting of the other, of this danger abroad that is going to come and steal your house and, hurt your children, I think is leading to these kinds of mainstreaming ideas of saying things like it's okay to bomb your number one trading partner, to suggest that you can do whatever you want. I mean, the Republican Speaker of the House said, referring to Lopez Obrador, saying that, no, you're not going to do this without our cooperation, saying, we're the United States, Mr. President, we will do whatever we want, right? That's the attitude.
Trump already wanted to do that. He wanted to do that in his first administration.
He probably will if he wins. He probably will. That will be one of the first things.
Mike Esper in his memoirs talked about Trump wanting to lob some bombs into Mexico and blame the cartels, right? And they had to talk him out of it. There's some really interesting comments over here. Thanks so much for your, of course, for your support and for your interaction in the chat. Edo says, only immigrants can be both poor and illiterate, but also vote and steal your job, right? It's the dual bind there, right? They're poor and illiterate, but they're also at the same time, how are they stealing your job then, right? Illegal immigrants are simply a scapegoat, says Mexican reformists. Citizens can barely vote in many states, to be honest, says Sarah.
Right.
Not to mention undocumented people, citizens.
Especially
right? ID requirements and tightening up the rules on absentee ballots and early voting. Putting up trabas, so many different rules there. Gloria says, it's such a damn idea. When you are illegal, all you want to do is survive here. And I know that for a fact. That's it. All you want to do is survive. And they've created these conspiracy theories where, the immigrants are the danger. And that's fascism. That's
playing
absolutely
cats and dogs.
that's straight up. Sometimes they misuse the word fascism, but that really is a fascist idea. The idea of the immigrant horde, and that has long roots in American nativism, U.S. nativism, going back to the yellow peril, the paranoia about Chinese, the Italians back in the day, that they were Catholics and they were going to turn the country into a papist plot. U.S. nativism goes in a lot of different directions, and it's the paranoid style in U.S. politics that we've talked about so much. And every immigrant group has gone through it. It wasn't that long ago that they were dousing Mexicans with gasoline at the U.S. border because they thought they were unhygienic. They would douse them with gasoline in order for them to let them into that country, until finally some woman said, "I'm not going to let you do that to me." That wasn't too long ago in our history.
And speaking about like history, if you allow me, guys, I do want to say that Donald Trump constantly in his rallies would warn that, or would threat with implementing an operation worse than the one Dwight Eisenhower implemented in the 50s. It was a very racist. It even had a racist name. It was called Operation Wetback.
Wetback, yeah.
Which he deported about 1.3 million people of Mexican origin. But the problem was not only that. He wasn't only deporting undocumented folks. He was deporting naturalized citizens and citizens that were born here in the United States, and they were second and third generation, only because they were from Mexican origin. And Trump has, I don't know if he actually knows what Dwight Eisenhower did, but the people behind him do. And he's constantly, he constantly said in his rallies that he was going to be way worse than Dwight Eisenhower, that this massive operation of deportation is going to take place in the United States. He's gonna get the help of the army. He sounds completely like Hitler. A lot of people, a lot of experts coming to any kind of shows and saying that's not possible to deport millions of people. Well, another genocidal asshole did this some decades ago. He deported millions of people using trains to concentration camps from Germany and other countries. So that's why I think we should be thinking about this very, very seriously, because history may repeat with someone like Donald Trump, and I mean he's threatening with doing it. Now that Jose Luis shows us the results, we're gonna be more terrified about everything.
You're unfortunately correct. I'm gonna put one up here where this is bad news. So we were joking in our chat that the election we were all really watching was Governor of Puerto Rico. As we know, Puerto Rico ended up being a piece of the election here, but it looks like Jennifer Gonzalez, the pro-Trump candidate, has won there. Unfortunately, Juan Dalmau was, a really exciting project. It was really kind of generating a lot of enthusiasm, a pro-independence candidate. As we know, one of the last remaining colonies is Puerto Rico, Estado Libre Asociado, but we know it's part of the U.S. empire. It doesn't look like he won. So that's bad news there in terms of, those are not official results. There's still some left, but I believe Dalmau is likely to concede if he hasn't already. So bad news on that front. I thought I would bring with that. But in other bad news, I will bring up here, this is the New York Times presidential election results. Now, this is the results officially as polls start to close. As you know, you need 270 electoral college votes to win in the United States. For those of you who do not know, they don't have universal suffrage in the sense that it's not the popular vote that counts, but instead the electoral college. So it ends up boiling down to a handful of swing states. And it's not looking good for Kamala Harris. So the swing states in this election are Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina. And they're all considered ahead of the election to be a toss-up. So it could go either way. Now, the Times is also running this the live presidential forecast.
Yeah.
And approximately 15 minutes ago, for the first time tonight, according to Nate Cohn, the estimates for the New York Times say that the race leans towards Trump. So that is our first indication of how the night's going to go. Obviously, it's going to take a very long process, but if you're looking at the way that things are forecasting in terms of how these swing states might go, it looks like Trump might win by virtue of the Electoral College delivering him the minimum 270 votes he needs to become president. Kind of similar to what happened in 2016. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, lost the Electoral College.
It's looking very much like 2016, which is no coincidence because Kamala basically copied Hillary's 2016 strategy of coddling Republicans and Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney and Republican endorsements and, distancing themselves from the left and actually suppressing the left. In this case, the left didn't have a candidate like it did Bernie Sanders in 2016, but it had the college protesters and the Gaza protesters and, people on the ground, organizing. Shut them down, had nothing to do with them. You wouldn't see her at a rally with Bernie Sanders. No. Liz Cheney, yes, but Bernie Sanders, no. So you see her doing Hillary 2016 with, so far tonight, the exact same result. The exact same result. She's ahead narrowly in the popular vote, not doing very well in the where she needs to win. Well, if you go back to Jose Luis, where it says president, there's a map that shows the shift from 2020, which I think is interesting to show. The shift from 2020 does not look good so far. All of those red arrows are arrows where Trump is doing better tonight than he did in the 2020 election, and there's a lot of those. The blue arrows are arrows where Kamala is doing better, running better than Biden. And there's a few pockets of that in Georgia so far. But right now, Trump is running ahead everywhere so far. Now, that isn't necessarily a nationwide trend. There could be regional differences. In a lot of these states, the Democrats didn't even campaign, right? You see a lot of arrows in Kentucky, they'd given up Kentucky. They didn't try in Kentucky. So that isn't necessarily indicative of the entire country. But there are, he's running ahead of himself in Virginia. Looks like they're going to win Virginia, but less than 2020. You see a lot of those red arrows in North Carolina and Georgia. So Trump is now ahead in North Carolina and Georgia. If he wins North Carolina and Georgia, that means that Harris then needs to win the entire blue wall. That entire blue wall up around the Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. She has to sweep those. She has to then at that point if she can't get North Carolina or Georgia, and then we'll see what happens in the Sun Belt. There's a long way to go, but you see that her options are narrowing, and there are now states that looks like she's going to have to win.
That's just it. That's what I was going to say. The way that it's often explained is that there are paths to victory, but those paths are to be reduced based on your performance. And those paths are increasingly looking very, very difficult, must-win situations in some of these swing states that she wasn't polling that particularly well in for her to be able to win. So it's looking at this point, we are, we don't have a crystal ball and we're not here to call the winner, but the trends indicate that Trump might just win. Antonio, how does that make you feel?
I mean, I like to be more optimistical, but I mean, you're just thinking that maybe those 40 electoral votes in California would help Kamala Harris. But yeah, definitely, this is looking pretty bad for the Democratic Party. I mean, there's going to come a moment in which the result's going to be impossible to retract. And yeah, I mean, where else is there to say about these horrible results? That I just want to insist on this. This is going to affect everybody. A lot of people in the audience of Censura would tell us that Trump is just a pájaro en algodón. That's like he just talks and talks and won't fulfill his threats. But I think he did fulfill some of his threats during his tenure, and I mean, this could be this could be the start. We're in Mexico. We're getting to the one real and only transformation. This could be definitely the start of fascist state in the United States. And like as you were saying, guys, as a using the textbook definition of what fascism is. Uh, I do see now like a very feasible use of that Project 2025 with having this all this support. I thought it was going to be a close election, but it looks like it's not going to be even a close election. It looks like maybe Trump wins for landslide. So this is this is pretty bad.
I see a
Guillermo
comment
asks,
here.
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yep.
No, I was just going to say, I see a comment here. I'll throw it up on the screen. Well, time to see how it plays out and wake up tomorrow, look at social media and see the winner. Either way, Mexico has to be ready. And I think that's just it.
Mm-hmm. Mexico has to be ready. And if you can put the next one up, the next comment by Guillermo, because I think the question is important, and I think it reflects a problem with how we got to where we are. When politicians, Democrats or Republicans, will do anything to address the domestic issues, like good health care plans, increase the minimum salary, loans, house prices. Thank you. This is just it. This is very, very, very important, right? Kamala Harris supposedly was in favor of Medicare for all. She was actually a co-sponsor of the bill years ago. She walked that back. No longer in favor of Medicare for all. Minimum wage, it's still $7.25 an hour nationally. A lot of states, it's different. Democrats have never managed to get the minimum wage up, and they abandoned that under Biden. It was very close to passing, and they didn't, right? Whereas in Mexico, the minimum wage has been increased year by year, right? Between 50 and 20% under López Obrador. And it's going to keep going up under Claudia Sheinbaum until it gets to 2.5 canastas básicas, which are the basic food basket to feed a family. Now, the Mexican minimum wage is still far too low. It's still far too low. But it's still, at least it's trending in the right direction. And the wage issue is something that the Democrats have abandoned. Student loans. The Sanders wing of the party has fought to eliminate student loans, right? To wipe them out. Biden made some half-hearted attempts to try to eliminate student loans. The Supreme Court threw that back, but didn't try hard enough and didn't do it in a legal way that it could get that job done. And so student loan payments started up again just before the election in the United States. How terrible is that politically? Student loans that had been frozen during COVID. The Democrats allowed the student loan payments to start back up just before the election. Brilliant, guys. Just brilliant to make people's student loan payments start up again. House prices through the roof. Through the roof. House prices and rents in the U.S., right? Democrats haven't had much to say about that either. I think it's in California, you have to earn over $120,000 a year just to be able to afford just a very basic house. Now, where are the Democrats? What proposals, what solutions have they come up with for that? In Mexico, Sheinbaum wants to build 1 million units of public housing. Not enough for a country of 126 million, but it's a good program. It's a great program. What the Democrats want to do is increase more private building, but private building, it's not going to solve the problem because private building helped create the problem in the first place because they create, buildings, housing for speculation. And you have a problem in the United States where you have the funds, the big vulture funds that are buying up housing and raising prices because they realize how big of a market that is. So Guillermo's question is the right question to ask. Where are the Democrats on good health care plans, minimum wage, student loans, and house prices? Not enough.
They tried to copy Trump's agenda. At some point, I'm quite sure that in order to satisfy those conservative voters, racist and conservative voters, they started to copy, as we were talking, the whole policies that Donald Trump is trying to implement. It's just you're totally right, Kurt. There is no a proposal by the Democrats or by Kamala Harris, and this is the result. I want to insist that I thought that it was going to be a very close election, and now we're seeing that it's not going to be, not anymore. The numbers keep getting higher. Speaking about Trump, he's now at 188 electoral votes, and Harris only has 99. I think that's it's becoming closer and closer to be reversible.
Harris still has a path to victory, but it's a narrow one. She has to sweep the blue wall and then pick up something in Nevada, Arizona, or New Mexico. So, but the trend is not looking good. And if she loses by a little bit in each state, you have to ask, why couldn't she have called for a ceasefire in Gaza? At least just that, just the minimum. Why couldn't she do that?
Right.
Would they rather lose to Trump than change an inch of their Gaza policy? Why couldn't she come out with a more robust economic package? Jacobin today, the magazine I write for, came out with a really interesting article today saying a strong economic package pulled much better than the messaging that Kamala wound up using, that democracy is in peril under Trump. That's an argument that plays to suburban, people and proceduralists and all of that. But that actually doesn't poll well in general in the United States, this idea of democracy in peril. What polled a lot better was a strong economic message. And there was some intimations that they were going to go that way, and they totally shut that down and totally went coddle Republicans in the last 6 weeks. Why did Biden win in 2020? I don't like Biden at all. And actually, Biden's a war criminal and he's a despicable human being. But he won in 2020 because he co-opted enough of Bernie's plans to look progressive enough to inch over the finish line in 2020. Kamala didn't even do that. She went right back to Hillary 2016. These high-paid Democratic consultants who always have them repeat the same thing. And, it's like, they're not going to lose their jobs. The consultants are not going to lose their jobs. The people in the Democratic Party are not going to lose their jobs. They're very comfortable. Win or lose. They don't have to, they don't care. It's the working class people. It's the poor people. It's the people living in their cars. The people who lose their houses because of healthcare. Those are the people who are going to pay the price. It's the undocumented people. And the people who are going to be rounded up and the people who are going to put in camps and all that. Those are the people who are going to pay for this. Not the consultants. Not the party apparatchiks, not the Harris people, not the Congress people who make millions on insider trading on their own laws that they're going to be passing, not Nancy Pelosi with her, swanky refrigerator and her ice creams. Those people are not going to be hurting here. So they don't feel any sense of urgency whatsoever.
Well, we heard it from AOC, right? She doesn't want to do that resistance nonsense anymore. Yeah. Just a gain to some of these people, even the so-called progressives. I want to throw this comment up here on the screen. Yes, Mexico has promises, yes, but they're keeping them and making sure they benefit Mexico. That's the reason Morena are popular, because they keep their promises and help the poor. I wanted to throw up here on the screen this article from Kurt from Jacobin magazine. Basically makes this argument, right? Mexico's lessons for the international left. Claudia Sheinbaum won Mexico's presidential election thanks to her party's record of passing universal social policies, respecting working class voters, and rejecting biased media narratives. I similarly wrote a piece for The Nation along the same lines here. Mm-hmm. Claudia Sheinbaum's victory shows how the left can win. It's a little, got the paywall there in the way, but anyway, point is that I think in a lot of ways, one of the things I've seen is that there is a certain sense of arrogance among some circles in the United States, thinking that it's where politics begins and ends. But I do think that as people reflect on this result, if it ends up holding up, there's something to be said about the experience of what's happening just south of the border for them here in Mexico, in terms of what politics looks like here in this country, what political leaders have been able to deliver, and the very successful result that has produced for Morena, right? I mean, Lopez Obrador's landslide victory in 2018 was huge. We had never seen anything like that. Who would have thought that 6 years later, Claudia Sheinbaum would have won by an even bigger margin, by even more votes, the supermajority in the Congress. So I encourage the people who are watching and maybe asking themselves these hard questions as they see these results come in, take a look at the Nation article that I wrote there, or Kurt's Mexican's Lesson for the International Left. I think there's a lot to pay attention to. So we're only a few minutes away from 9 p.m. here in Mexico City. Give you a last opportunity. I think we'll wrap up right beforehand. Kurt and Antonio, a few last parting words here as we start to digest. And if you're anything like me, you're probably going to be stuck to your phones or the screen all night waiting to see what comes through. Even if it's 3 a.m, we still don't know. We'll be there paying attention. So any last words?
Go ahead, Kurt. You go first.
Well, I think what we've seen is exactly what Jose Luis was just mentioning. This kind of this arrogance of the Democratic Party to think that they can repeat the same campaign and have a different result. And at least up till now, that's not happening. So in that sense, they've lost this election themselves. Right? We've talked about this a lot on the podcast, right? That there are two different faces to imperialism. And one is the Republican kind of brash, in-your-face, threatening rhetoric towards Mexico and Latin America. But the other is this kind of chingaquedito, kind of constantly kind of butting in kind of thing that we've seen from the Biden administration over the last few years. So we've seen no transparency on the kidnapping of Mayo Zambada. We've seen the DEA with their 1.5-year campaign with the Chapitos without giving a heads up to the Mexican government whatsoever. We see Ken Salazar openly involving himself in Mexican politics by opposing the energy reform and opposing the judicial reform, and running around the country as if he were in a campaign, meeting with governors. So, I'm not sold on this argument that Democrats are less interventionists. They're more hypocritical about it. They're more two-faced about it. They have a nicer discourse about it. But if you see Laura Richardson from Southcom going around South America right now under a Democratic regime, it's the exact same playbook. They've turned Ecuador into a U.S. colony, protectorate, in all but name, under Noboa. And Noboa just signed off carte blanche for the U.S. to operate in Ecuadorian waters, land, and air. Laura Richardson was off in Chile, taking her picture with Allende's granddaughter, Ministry of Defense under Boric. They have their hands all over the lithium triangle. Right? With Argentina, they have an open door with Milei. Now they're going after the Bolivian Chile side of it. Is this any different than what Trump would do? I'm just asking. I'm not saying. I'm just asking. Is U.S. policy in Latin America substantially different than what we've seen over the last few years? Is the genocide in Gaza any different? Is the brinkmanship towards World War III in Ukraine any different? Is the protectionism against China and trying to keep out Chinese solar panels and Chinese cars any different? I'm just asking. I'm not declaring. These are the hard questions that we have to ask ourselves all over the world on this. And the fact that a democratic foreign policy hasn't had anything else to show for it is part of the reason why they're in the mess they're in right now in these results. Now, I agree with what has been said in this conversation last night about some of the unique dangers of Trump. I think Tonio is absolutely right that there's more of a visceral and ideological hatred against Mexicans and Latinos. That you can't deny. There's more of an ideological far-right hatred of Mexicans and Latinos. And that has to be taken into account in any analysis. And of course, a reckoning with how to go forward, right? That's there. But the structure of U.S. foreign policy is such that the left has basically abandoned an anti-imperialist and anti-militarist voice. I remember when I was a kid in the 1980s, there was a very articulated movement in defense of Central America at the time, in defense of El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua. Now, it didn't succeed in stopping the horrors of what Reagan did, but there was a very well-articulated movement. And it seems like the left, the younger generation of the left, has turned more inward and is focused on what's going on in the U.S. And one can understand how it's very difficult. Life is difficult in the U.S. these days. But I think the left in the U.S. has lost the internationalism it used to have.
In some circles, anti-imperialism is a slur.
Yeah, even. So you see very little challenge to the Democratic Party when it acts with reckless murderousness in the world. The Republicans as well, but I'm talking about the Democrats at this moment. There was somewhat of a challenge from the Bernie wing, but the Bernie rhetoric was always that what we did in Guatemala in 1954 was bad. What we did in Chile in 1973 was bad. Bernie would always talk about things that were safely in the past and say that was bad. But when it comes to present issues in Latin America and the rest of the world, Bernie was much less progressive. He magically morphed into someone who was much less progressive. So nothing to say about current imperialism in Latin America. He's been terrible on Gaza. Terrible. And so you see the whole Bernie AOC wing has just knuckled under to Bidenism, Kamalism. Been pathetic to see, actually. It's been pathetic on Gaza, on Latin America, right? Basically everything. There's not been an articulated alternative to imperialism in U.S. foreign policy, like there was back in the 80s, like there was in the 60s, like there was back 100 years ago when writers like Mark Twain founded the Anti-Imperialist League. Imagine having something like that nowadays. It would be seen as a joke. It would be seen as a joke if literary writers created an anti-imperialist league like existed back in the time of the invasion of Cuba and Puerto Rico, in the Philippines, in Hawaii. Just not even on the radar now of so many people in the American left. You try to get people interested in what's going on in Mexico, it's hard to even get them interested, with laudable exceptions like Breakthrough News and a few others. So that's where we're at here. And so that leads to a point where it's difficult for the U.S. left to see that there are places where they could learn lessons from. And one of those places is Mexico. And that's what's in that article of mine in Jacobin, and that's what's like in your article in The Nation. So I don't know. I'm not very optimistic about what's going on in the United States. I think Mexico cannot overreact to a Trump victory if that happens, and has to continue its course of sovereignty, because what the Trumpists want is for Mexico to get intimidated and to veer off into doing what they want them to do without Trump even having to lift a finger, just with the rhetoric. And don't underestimate Claudia Sheinbaum on this. I think they've certainly war-gamed how to deal with either incoming administration and their strengths and their weaknesses of each one. Because Trump also has a weakness. Trump's weakness is he's got a very short attention span. So he threatens Mexico one day and then kind of gets what he wants, kind of the art of the deal kind of thing, and then he moves on to something else. He's not as consistent in things. So there are weaknesses and flaws in there that an astute Mexican foreign policy can, Ramon de la Fuente and co over there can exploit. And also the United States is in serious decline. It's in decline, folks. It's in decline. And its client states are not doing well either. So this is not the United States even of 2016. It's in much more serious geopolitical decline than it was 8 years ago. It doesn't have as strong a hand. Israel is losing. Ukraine is losing. The U.S. economy is losing out to China. It's not the same geopolitical situation that it was 8 years ago when Trump first took power. And I hope, the powers that be over in the Cancilleria in Mexico recognize that fact, that it's a different world now, and it's a multipolar world now. you know, the US currency is not what it was, and that Mexico is in a stronger position in 2024 than it was in 2016 under Peña Nieto, for God's sake. It's in a stronger negotiating position. It's going to be in a stronger negotiating position to renegotiate NAFTA when that comes up in 2026. So that's all by way of saying that the results look bad, but Mexico is looking good. And it shouldn't forget that.
Antonio, I'll give a
Right.
last word to you
Well,
before we say goodbye.
I agree in many things with Kurt, dear Jose Luis, but I think perhaps it would be wise to address the positives, the bright side on this turnout. There were a lot of people worried about, terrified about having a civil war if, uh, I mean, the result would be so close. If Trump would have lost for a couple of electoral votes, and there was a lot of fear, anguish about having a civil war from all this outcome, right? Now, I mean, we know that the Democratic Party is going to concede, is going to accept the results, so that's a positive. Also, I do want to say that our friend, the writer and journalist Francisco Cruz, he has lived in the United States for a long time. He has been a correspondent here for a long time. He was saying that the Pentagon anyway has any kind of uh, strategies to destroy any civil war attempt that would be out there, since the actual civil war we faced it here in the United States in the 19th century. So, I mean, maybe there was going to be uh, some turmoil, but now we're kind of in the way of avoiding all that turmoil. Second, I think this is going to be excellent to teach Democrats that they cannot mess with the real choice of the people. As you guys were mentioning before, the there was not condemning the genocide in the Gaza Strip was a terrible mistake, and not only that, ignoring the people in their real needs was also a terrible mistake. A lot of people right now are uh, punishing the Democratic Party with their votes. A lot of people are voting for Dr. Jill Stein just to punish the Democrats, and they're letting win. I mean, at what cost? Not, but letting Trump win. So I think this is a really good chance to teach the Democrats that they cannot mess with the people, and that they need to be closer to what it really matters for us. Also, it's going to be an opportunity for us to organize. I am convinced that we have a chance to reform the electoral system of the United States, an electoral system designed on purpose by our founding fathers, because they thought that the right to vote had to be in the hands of the better men, according to them. There's like this Federalist paper by Hamilton in which he does all this reflection on how it is impossible for the ignorant people to decide for such an important position as is the main magistrate of the United States, which is the president of the United States. So I think this is a very good opportunity for us to demand a reform to that electoral system that is not helping us at all, that is not democratic. And let me tell you something, it's not impossible to organize and fulfill this dream. There was, uh, there is this man. His name is Andrés Manuel López Obrador. After he got cheated again on 2012, after he was the object of another fraud, he abandoned his former party and founded a new party, and everybody thought he was crazy, since in Mexico there are so many leftist movements, and from those same leftist movements, it could derive in many more leftist movements from just one group that congregates in a place. So I think there is an opportunity for us to form a real left, a real progressive movement, a real progressive party, and uh, push for the reforms we need. Also, Trump, even if he tries to deport us all, he's not going to be able to really stop our presence as Mexicans here. And I do believe in the concept of the State 33 of Mexico, which is our whole community, our whole, our whole of 40 plus million Mexicans or people of Mexican origins. I do think that we have a lot of potential to have presence in Washington, D.C. with uh, a real loving system. So I think there are many opportunities in front of us. Yes, it's going to be a very, very difficult time for us. The future for our kids is looking very, very dark right now. Speaking about policies uh, that have to do with climate change, that have to do with real social social policies, like social benefits policies. So I think there's like obviously this really really bad panorama, but at the end there are also many opportunities to make the left grow, as it happened in Mexico with someone that they thought he was crazy, but he achieved what nobody believed he would be able to achieve. Now the question is, who is going to be that face that represents the progressives in the United States? Who is going to be that uh, messiah? I don't want to sound like Krause, but who's going to be that messiah? Who's going to be that very very recognizable face that would represent the the left in the United States, and that would be able to face this fascist state? That's I think that should be the question at the end. And I do want to thank you for inviting me to this show. It has been fantastic. It hasn't been a long time since I would participate in a show in which we would speak completely and entirely in English, like I do here with my family. But, yeah. I am very honored to be here with you guys.
Now, the honor is ours. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're about to go off, but it's 9:14 here in Mexico City. As of right now, the live presidential forecast, as determined by the New York Times, gives Trump a 78% chance of victory. There's still a lot of data that needs to come in, as we can see this point here. Trump is a narrow but clear favorite to win Georgia and North Carolina. If he does carry those states, Harris would probably need to sweep Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin to win. A real possibility, but a tall order. We have little data, so we still don't know. We're not going to make any declarations here. But one last look here at what the results are looking like. It's not looking good for Harris. A lot of the swing states appear to be leaning Republican at this point. Those paths to victory are increasingly less. And that means we may awaken to the news that Trump has won the Electoral College, and by virtue of that, will be the president again come 2020-25. And that means a lot in terms of the U.S.-Mexico relationship. But we survived Trump before. I don't think we will have trouble doing it again. And of course, again, really want to emphasize what Kurt had to say earlier today. We have to shift the conversation. It's not about who's better or worse for Mexico. It's about what is Mexico going to do in the face of the reality that is now before us. Antonio, it's actually been a really, really big pleasure talking with you. This has been a great program. I don't think we've ever done anything this long before. I want to thank everybody in the chat with all of their comments. Of course, the members of the St. Patrick's Battalion that support the work of the Soberania podcast, and everybody else who tunes in. As always, give it a like, subscribe, share with your friends. If you enjoyed the program today, let us know. Give us a comment, and maybe we'll do some more lives. You up for that, Kurt? You up for another live sometime soon?
I am definitely up for it. Yeah, I want to echo.
Invite me again, and for the St. Patrick's Battalion, Eringo Brach.
That's right.
I just want to echo what Jose Luis said. It's we started Soberania in February, small effort, right? Shoestring effort with just the two of us. We've been happy to see it grow. We've been happy to see the views have grown, the interest has grown. If you like what we're doing, go over to Soberania, join, subscribe, and you can become also a supporter and member of the battalion. It's 99 pesos a month, which is, about $5. It's about a latte. And that'll help us be able to reinvest that in promotion and be able to spiff up things a little bit, and maybe down the line get another camera, have a 2-camera setup, and some more lights and some more of that good stuff. Right? To make.
Did you see Antonio's setup there? He did a little camera switch at one point. I don't know if you caught that.
Yeah.
That's what we want.
Oh, very nice.
I tried to go to a more stable connection. I am having a lot of technical difficulties here.
Oh no, it looked great.
It was fine.
Yeah.
At some point, I could do the more stable connection.
For the cost of a latte a month, you can help us out, and keep sharing our stuff. Keep talking about Soberania, and keep being interested in what's going on in Mexico and in Latin America. Jay has a good point above. I was a little negative on the U.S. Anglo-American left. He pointed out that the Palestine Solidarity Movement is obviously very strong. And that Bernie was very strong against the Nicaraguan sanctions back in the 80s. I remember when he was mayor of Burlington, he did go to Nicaragua, one of the very few U.S. elected officials to do that. The problem is now, as a sitting senator, he's become much more, cowardly on these things. That's the problem, right? Yeah. Anyway, on that note, go and get yourself a stiff drink, everyone, and see if you can survive the rest of the evening with the results without us.
All right, thanks everybody for tuning in. And of course, we'll have a full breakdown next week for a regular episode on its regular date and time, giving you our perspective on the results and what it means for Mexico once we actually have the final word. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Good night.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.
All right.